What's going on, guys? Today I'm going to be sharing my final thoughts on Radiant Historia Perfect Chronology. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on Perfect Chronology as a remake and on the added content. It's no secret that I find the base game itself to be absolutely fantastic, and I have talked about it in a separate video which I'll link in the description. Today we're going to be focusing on the changes made in Perfect Chronology and what I liked and disliked about the remake. I will say that as a whole, I definitely do think that Perfect Chronology is significantly better than the original, but it's also lacking in certain areas. I want to start off by talking about the possible histories. Early on in Perfect Chronology, Stock encounters a brand new character named Nemesia, who is researching the Fallen Empire, which is mentioned in the original game but not really explored in great detail. Nemesia goes on to explain that she is searching for relics called artifacts, which can potentially put an end to the desertification. To find these artifacts, Stock must travel to possible histories, which are pretty much alternate timelines that have diverged in some way. Some of them are alternate scenarios to events that happen in the main story, while others involve characters that hold a different position or social status that they do in the main stories, or they can have a completely different personality altogether. In these timelines, the artifact holder is typically corrupt in some way, and Stock must solve a specific issue to get the artifact back. These scenarios were pretty fun, and as a fan of the original game, it was nice to see all these what-if situations. It also gave extra development to every character in the main cast and even some side characters. For the most part, they were a breath of fresh air. It was great seeing Marco's time in the spotlight or having more Rosh and Sonya moments. But some of the scenarios were also pretty bad or even inconsistent with the rules of the original game. I will have a spoiler section of this video where I go into more detail on some of the scenarios I liked and some of the ones I disliked. As a whole, I was having fun with them, but there were definitely a couple of them that were pointless and a few that didn't make sense. One thing that I did find a little bit weird about these scenarios is that you can use any character in any possible history. This was strange because the base game is really particular about which characters are playable at a given moment, so the possible histories were definitely inconsistent with the main game in that regard. I also found the explanation behind the existence of these possible histories to be very vague. Nemesia explains that, quote, "There are as many possibilities as stars in the sky," and while this isn't necessarily inconsistent with anything else in the game, I do find it to be a weak and lazy explanation. I would have really liked to have seen what specific decisions in each of the possible histories led to that world being different. The game pretty much only tells you that these possible histories are the way they are because anything is possible. I suppose that is acceptable, but I think it would have been better if Nemesia gave a brief explanation of what happened after every scenario. It's pretty clear that she has researched these histories, given that she gives Stock a briefing of what's going on before every single mission, so it's not really a stretch to say that she should be able to explain the changes that made the scenario different. On the topic of Nemesia, I really did like her character because she was generally very positive. She makes for a nice contrast with the rest of the cast and the general mood of the game, which has a fairly sad tone. She's very upbeat and even occasionally throws some jokes around, which is pretty rare for Radiant Historia. She also has a really heartwarming story that comes to the forefront at the end of the game. But if I had one complaint about her character, it's that there really isn't much going on with her for a good chunk of the game. Her conversations with Stock early on are shallow, and you really don't get to know her character until the very end. I personally would have liked to have seen her have more casual conversations with Stock early on. The next thing I want to talk about is the art style in Perfect Chronology. The general consensus is that the art style in Perfect Chronology is worse than the original, and I definitely do agree with this sentiment. I remember looking at one of the earlier trailers and being absolutely horrified with how the characters looked. The original had a very unique art style, and I didn't really understand why it was abandoned for something that looked like every other JRPG and anime. But once I started playing the game, I quickly got used to the art style. I still think that most of the characters look worse than they did in the original, but the art style really didn't bother me that much. The only exception to this is Field Marshal Viola. Her design is an absolute abomination. But I can actually say that I liked Erica's design a bit more in Perfect Chronology, mainly because I thought that the long hair really suited her. There were also a couple of side characters from the original game that got portraits in Perfect Chronology. In particular, it was awesome seeing a design of the Prophet Noah, who was a character I thought about a lot over the years. But I would have liked to have seen a few more new designs. It would have been nice if we had gotten designs for the Resistance members, Will, Pierre, and Otto, since they are fairly relevant to the plot. I would have also liked to have seen a few character designs in Rosh's brigade in the alternate history. I always found it really weird how it was a bunch of generic looking NPCs and Keel, who really stuck out. It would have been cool to have gotten a couple of more characters to make the brigade a bit more interesting. Even if these hypothetical characters turn out to be shallow, it would at least not make it so goddamn obvious that Keel is the only one that matters. Now back to the topic of art. Perfect Chronology did add a few gallery portrait images and I really liked them. There weren't too many of them, but it was nice to see a detailed drawing of a particular scene. I actually didn't know about these going into the game, so I totally fanboyed when I saw the shot of Erica in Grenork's castle in Chapter 1. The original game is one of my all-time favorites, so every little detail that was added in Perfect Chronology was very exciting for me. Speaking of that, Perfect Chronology also added voice acting, and it was a surreal experience to hear these characters being voiced for the first time ever. I found out that I've been pronouncing a bunch of stuff wrong all these years. In particular, I used to call Granorg, and I used to call Heis Heis. From what I've seen, the fan reaction to the voice acting is pretty mixed, but I enjoyed it for the most part. I thought that most of the cast did a good job, with the exception of Garland, who I thought sounded very strange, and Rosh, who had bad range and sounded really weird during some of the more emotional scenes. I'll explain what I mean by this in the spoiler section of this video. Now, I have seen some people make the claim that the voice acting makes this game worse than the original, and I think that that is a ridiculous point, given that you have the option of turning off the voice acting if you don't like it. So I really don't understand how having the option of voice acting can make Perfect Chronology worse than the original. On top of this, the script in Perfect Chronology is much better than the original, which honestly had a pretty bad localization. There are tons of moments that just sound really weird in English and a few phrases that are fragments of the Japanese language. Perfect Chronology corrects a lot of these issues. For example, in the original game, after being victorious in the prologue, Rainey states, quote, "Another one in the win column for us." This is obviously really awkward given that it's their first mission, and Perfect Chronology corrects blunders like this. There were a few moments when playing Perfect Chronology where I had the original game script right in front of me, and there were corrections made every couple of lines. Now, Perfect Chronology's localization is still not perfect. There are definitely still a few weird moments, but it's way better than the original game's localization. Perfect Chronology also successfully improves upon the gameplay of the original without changing its core. It's the perfect example of a remake that improves upon the original without changing it so much that it's nothing like the original. The biggest addition to Perfect Chronology were support attacks. Basically, at the beginning or end of a combo, one of your sideline characters has a chance to use a support skill based on their luck stat. These can be anything from physical attacks, magic attacks, enemy scans, or even healing. The cool thing about this is that it adds another element to building your party. There's a lot more options. Not only do you have to consider what a character brings to the table in your main party, you also need to think about whether the character would be more useful on the sidelines with their support skills. It also makes a few characters more useful than they were in the original. Marco, for example, quickly becomes obsolete in the original because he gets outclassed by Ott, who has earlier access to better healing and has abilities like traps and cross star as offensive options. But on the sidelines, Marco is incredibly useful. He's consistently giving your party buffs, and he definitely saved my ass a few times with his support revival. Perfect Chronology also adds much needed difficulty options. The original game was pretty easy for me, and I honestly steamrolled it every time I played it. I played Perfect Chronology on hard mode, and it was really a nice challenge. I was dying pretty consistently, and I really needed to think about the battle system at a deeper level and have a solid strategy. I have a newfound appreciation for the battle system in this game. For those of you who watched my previous video on this game, I was pretty lukewarm about the battle system. I made it clear that I liked it, but that I found the story to be better. But I've since changed my mind on this. The battle system in Radiant Historia is fantastic, and it really deserves as much praise as its story. There's so many possibilities with this grid system, and it's so satisfying to manipulate the grid in a way that devastates the enemy in a swift combo. Between the assault moves, the aerial attacks, the turn order manipulation, and the support skills, there's practically an infinite number of possibilities. Another welcome addition to the gameplay is the Vault of Time, which is a centralized grinding spot that stock can access via the White Chronicle for training. This was a useful addition given that if you wanted to grind in the original, you often had to go to a specific node and go through a cutscene before you were able to grind. Also, the Vault of Time has its own currency called Memento, which you can gather up and spend it on healing items, better equipment, and support skills. The Vault of Time was definitely a good addition to the game, and I would definitely recommend spending some time there during your playthrough. And the last major change in Perfect Chronology was that a new ending and a New Game Plus mode was added. The new ending can be achieved by completing all of the possible histories on the Dunamis, and it acts as a sort of revision of the true ending in the original game. I was really impressed with this ending. It was really well fleshed out, and it had a lot more content than I was expecting. Honestly, I thought this new ending would just be some sort of bonus scene, but it was really a lot more than just that. It's a few hours long, and it really expands on concepts introduced in the original game and describes them in greater detail, especially on the topic of the ancient empire and the origin of the desertification. I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll be expanding on this in the spoiler section of this video. The next thing I want to quickly address is the DLC in Perfect Chronology. I'm not particularly fond of the DLC practices for the game, and I do think that it is overpriced. Make no mistake, the DLC for this game is absolutely garbage and not worth your money. At most, they provide you with 45 minutes of content in a recycled dungeon with very little dialogue. However, I have seen people make the claim that Perfect Chronology is an incomplete game or that you have to pay $25 for the rest of the game, and I want to emphasize that this is patently false. The original Radiant Historia was already a complete game with fully fleshed out characters, story, and a great battle system. The base game of Perfect Chronology expands on it greatly. If anything, it's a complete game with many bonuses. In addition, $9 of the DLC is purely cosmetic or consumable and has no content whatsoever. The rest of the DLC is fully optional, and you're not missing out on anything story related or character related. You are getting the full experience from the base game of Perfect Chronology, and the people who are making the claim that the game is incomplete have not played it. Once again, the DLC itself is garbage and not worth your money, but the base game of Perfect Chronology is 100% complete. Overall, I think that Perfect Chronology is a pretty good remake that adds a lot of content and quality of life improvements. It takes a game that's 30 to 35 hours long and turns it into an experience of over 50 hours. It's definitely not a perfect remake. The art style is not as good as the original, and some of the possible histories are very weird, and while the script has improved, there are still some weird translations. Also, I do think it was held back a little bit by the Nintendo 3DS's outdated hardware, and I really hope we get a Nintendo Switch version to see all the characters in HD and allow a new audience to enjoy it. But despite a few shortcomings, I think that Perfect Chronology is very clearly the definitive version of the game. I have seen a few people claiming that the original is the better choice, and I strongly disagree with this. While the art style is better in the original, Perfect Chronology has a better battle system. It has the possible histories, the new ending, New Game Plus, difficulty options, voice acting, better graphics, and quality of life improvements. If you ask me, it's not worth foregoing all of this for the better art style. And if you absolutely have to, the option of paying for the original art style is there. Although I would recommend just playing with the new art style. It's really not that bad. But of course, you guys are free to disagree with me, so leave a comment below and let me know what you think. This marks the end of the non-spoiler section of this video, and I will be going into spoiler territory now. If you haven't played the game, I would recommend clicking off right now. I want to start off this section by talking about some of the scenarios that I like and some of the ones I dislike. One of the scenarios that I really liked was Battlefield Breakout. This one diverged from Alternate History Chapter 2, where Viola was ambushed by the Empire and Keel was ultimately killed. But in Battlefield Breakout, Stock is able to reach Keel in time and rescue him. It was a really satisfying moment to be able to change the result of one of the saddest moments in the game, even if it was just a possible history. Another one that I really liked was War Torn Hearts, a scenario where Sonya offers to go to war in Rosh's place. I absolutely love Rosh and Sonya and the romance that develops between them throughout the game, so extra Rosh and Sonya moments are always a plus in my book. It was especially heartwarming to see how far Sonya will go for Rosh's sake. I also really loved Marco the Bouncer, since it was really nice to see a timeline where Marco and Mimmel end up together. As a general rule, I really loved the possible histories that gave us solid character development or provided us with a nice alternate scenario to an important scene from the main game. One of the ones that I really hated was Echoing Screams. In this scenario, Stock, Rainey, Marco, and Ott are in the Grand Plain when they hear a scream. They follow the sound until they see that Lys and Vanos are being threatened by Tarkin, who claims that he will detonate a bomb if the party goes any closer. My first problem with this scenario is that not only does it star two characters that I really don't care about, it doesn't do anything at all to make Lys or Vanos more interesting. All they're doing is being really scared and we don't learn anything about them, even after the conflict is resolved. But the worst part of this scenario is the false ending. If Stock approaches Tarkin, he detonates the bomb and everybody gets incinerated. This directly contradicts the idea that Stock cannot reverse an event if he dies, and this rule is extremely important to the game's plot because it provides the player with some doubt about whether Stock can succeed and ensures that he isn't omnipotent. The idea that Stock can somehow survive an explosion that he's right next to and then travel back to undo it is ridiculous. And lastly, for the good ending of this scenario, you are required to jump back in time and grab meat to lure a nearby animal. A couple of the possible histories make you jump back to grab a specific item, and that was always very annoying for me. It can be a little bit tedious, and most of the time it doesn't really add anything. Now I'm going to move on to voice acting. I mentioned earlier that I thought Rosh had a bad range and that he sounded monotone during the more emotional scenes. To illustrate this, I'm going to use the example of one of the most powerful and emotional scenes in the game, Keel's death in Alternate History Chapter 2. After being ambushed at the Grand Plain, Rosh, Stock, and Keel are in an awful position. Keel eventually decides to use himself as a decoy to allow Stock and Rosh to escape, and he throws himself out there and fights to the death, allowing Stock and Rosh to escape. This scene really encapsulates everything I love about Radiant Historia's plot. Keel is a trainee character with a lot of potential while Rosh is his mentor. In fiction, we would expect the mentor to die for the student. It's normal for the old to die for the young. But in this particular scene, we see the exact opposite. It really highlights how desperate the situation is in Radiant Historia when it comes to the war and desertification. The problem is so urgent that Keel's potential does not matter. Vanker needs individuals who are currently capable of changing the fate of the continent, and as a result, you see a reversal of roles. The young die to protect their mentors. I also love how Keel dies in a realistic way. He is a recruit with very limited fighting experience, and the scene demonstrates this. There's no Herculean moment or ass-pull power boost. It's Keel being swiftly eliminated in a battle that he has no chance of winning. It's a brutally honest and realistic moment. On top of all this, the scene shows that the White Chronicle is not an all-powerful object without limitations, and the use of the track where the wind and feathers return is perfect. The scene is a masterpiece in my eyes, and I'm very sensitive to any sort of change to this particular scene, and Rosh's voice acting definitely kills the mood.
No, leave me behind. Stock, take care of the brigade. You can't let Keel throw away his life playing decoy.
Don't get me wrong, Captain. I'm not seeking death. The Heavy Knight's armor slows them down enough that I could easily get away from them. And while I'm running, you two could slip away as well. This plan will work.
To hell with that. I
Stay with us!
There really isn't much urgency in his voice in this scene, given by the fact that he's on the brink of death and that Keel is ready to sacrifice himself for this. He's very monotone, and it honestly makes it a lot harder to take the scene seriously. I honestly think that the scene is much better without voice acting, and it's not the only moment where his voice sounds very monotone. Another good example would be his confrontation with Stock in Standard History Chapter 3, which leads to his temporary death. In general, there doesn't seem to be any change in his tone throughout the game regardless of the scene. Now let's get into one of the biggest changes in Perfect Chronology, which is the new true ending. It starts off with the final confrontation with Heiss, and instead of Heiss sacrificing himself for the ritual of Flux, Stock convinces him of working together to end de-desertification with the help of Nemesia. She goes on to explain that the Empire created a monster known as the Singularity through a series of failed Thaumaturg experiments. This Singularity is sucking up all of the mana, and defeating it will end the desertification. To achieve this, the party needs the power of the Black Chronicle, White Chronicle, and the newly added Red Chronicle. I gotta say that this is already a good way to start off this ending. I'm glad that we finally got a direct explanation on why the desertification is happening, since the original game only tells us vaguely that it started with the Fallen Empire. So the party then works together to compile the Red Chronicle by gathering all of its pages. For every page, we get some nice tidbits of a much larger story, which goes something like this. The desertification started 150 years ago when one of the Empire's experiments took a wrong turn. The mysterious princess of the Empire, who shall not be named, had fallen in love with a Thaumaturg scholar. Emperor Achalasia did not approve of this romance, and as punishment he had the scholar fused with the Black Chronicle. The scholar was completely overwhelmed by the Black Chronicle, and he collapsed into a living hunger known as the Singularity. This Singularity began absorbing the mana around it, and thus began the desertification. The Imperial Prince Allium and the mysterious princess, who is clearly not Nemesia, attempted to fight the Singularity, but they were only able to separate the Black Chronicle from it and seal it away in a temporal rift. Allium searched long and hard for a permanent cure to the desertification to no avail, and so he fled the Empire with his subjects as well as the Black and White Chronicle, and he created the Kingdom of Granorg. As a desperate measure, he created the Ritual of Flux to slow down the desertification by sealing the Singularity away. Now, 80 years ago, famine struck in Granorg, and the prophet Noah tried to solve the issue with Thaumaturg engineering. The king forbade this, which caused Noah and his followers to leave and start the kingdom of Alistel. I gotta say that I'm a huge fan of this backstory. It's clear, it's concise, and it explains a lot of the stuff that was vague in the original without introducing any major plot holes. In the original game, the desertification is sort of just accepted as a phenomenon that's happening, but in Perfect Chronology, they expand upon it in a coherent way. So after compiling the Red Chronicle, the party rendezvous with Heiss, and together they're ready to fight the Singularity. Each of the chronicles plays a unique role in the battle. The Red Chronicle has the power to control the possible worlds, and therefore it prevents the beast from going to another world. The Black Chronicle is all about the tragedies of the past, and it prevents the beast from escaping to another timeline. And finally, the White Chronicle will be used to create a new future. Once again, this makes perfect sense, and it's consistent with the themes associated with the White and the Black Chronicles from the original game, and it assigns a logical role to the Red Chronicle. So after this, we get a scene that seems relatively minor, but it is very important. The party finds themselves in Historia on the Dunamis and starts talking about when they all first met Stock. Ott asks Stock if he remembers when they first met, and Stock mentions their first meeting on both timelines, while she was traveling with Vanos in the Standard History and in Celestia in the alternate history. Ott claims that she has never been to Celestia with Stock, which suggests that the current timeline is following the Standard History. Gafka reinforces Ott's claim, which provides further evidence that the new true ending continues off the Standard History. The reason why this detail is so important is because it finally fixes the inconsistency problems with the original game's true ending. Don't get me wrong, I did like the original game's true ending, and it had a really strong appeal to emotion, but it was also an incredibly contradictory scene. It was pretty much a huge mesh of random shit that happened in the standard history and the alternate history with no clear rules or logic behind it. For example, we see Rosh and Sonya pay their respects to Keel and the rest of the squad that fell in battle, which is an event that clearly happened in the alternate history, but at the same time, the original ending shows Lise with the Granogrite soldier, which is a direct result of the Mankind and Beastkind side quest that occurred in the standard history. It also doesn't help that the White Chronicle randomly shows the two timelines merging together for no apparent reason, so Perfect Chronology's new ending fixes these problems. It essentially renders the mess of the original ending non-canon while also telling a coherent story that continues from the standard history. So after that little moment with Ott and Gafka, the party is ready to fight the Singularity. Nemezia explains that they are at the outskirts of the Vault of Time, and if it wasn't obvious enough, she essentially says that she is the princess of the fallen empire when she says, quote, "Allium and I can find the Singularity." If this wasn't awkward enough, Nemezia reveals just a few moments later that she is in fact the Imperial Princess, as if it's supposed to be a shocking moment even though she literally admits it earlier. This was a really weird moment, and I honestly don't know if it was a poor translation or just bad writing in general. But after that, we get a really heartwarming moment where Nemezia breaks down and pours her heart out for Rodon and how she doesn't want to fight. The dilemma she faces is a really awful situation for her, and I was definitely empathetic towards her. And with that, the party fights the Singularity and comes out victorious. They all escape together with the exception of Nemezia, who stays in the Vault of Time to be with Allium. Definitely a cheesy decision, but it also does make sense for her. Fast forward 1 year and we pretty much see all the loose plot threads getting resolved. We see that humans and Gootrolls coexist peacefully and that Gafka is no longer banned from Forgia, and Celestia has taken a similar position. They have opened their borders and appear to have more trust for humans. In Granorg, Erica is building the kingdom back up and appears to be doing a fine job as queen, and in Alistel, Rosh is now a general and Raul is the prime minister. It's also nice to see a happy ending for Viola, given that she was a tragic character that really fell from grace in the original game. But the scene with Viola also raises some questions given that she is an alternate history character and this ending appears to continue off the standard history. I suppose that we can't say that Stock and Viola became acquainted in the year-long time skip and that's how they know each other, but this isn't explicitly stated. Now we also do see Marco, who has pulled a Lulu and is now with his lover's little sister, and we see Heiss, who's freely traveling through time. We then get a scene of Stock returning to Scala where he lives with Rainey, and now Stock and Rainey were pretty much canon in the original, but with Perfect Chronology there's no doubt at all anymore. I'm pretty lukewarm when it comes to Stock and Rainey as a couple. They're definitely fine together and it's not an awful pairing by any means, but I'm generally of the belief that opposites do not attract and Stock and Rainey are definitely very different personalities. On top of that, Rainey is pretty much the only viable option for Stock, given that Erica is his sister, Ott is a child, and Nemezia is in love with Rodon. So it does kind of seem like Stock and Rainey get lumped together for convenience rather than compatibility. Now after the scene with Rainey, the party gathers at the Imperial Ruins where we see that the environmental scientist has successfully grown vegetation right at the root of the desertification. This was a beautiful scene since it finally shows a resolution of the main problem of the entire game. The desertification was the root cause of all of the conflicts and the collective anxiety of the people of Vancouver, and it's a beautiful thing to see Perfect Chronology go full circle and show the resolution of the problem right at its root cause. And finally, we get one last scene with Nemezia where Stock provides her with the seed of possibilities that appeared after restoring the Red Chronicle. It turns out that Rodon theorized that the Red Chronicle would create a new possibility for itself over time, and the seed is essentially a new artifact. The seed restores the Dunamis and Rodon randomly comes back to life cause reasons, and with that, they all return to Vancouver and live happily ever after. And that's pretty much it for my thoughts on the new ending. Once again, I really like this ending with the exception of a couple of ass-pulls and awkward moments. Anyways guys, this video has gone on long enough, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great day. And just one last thing, I want to give a big thank you to Mephilia for allowing me to use their footage for this video. So I will leave a link to their channel in the description. Check them out. They have lots of awesome Let's Plays for like different JRPGs and stuff. And once again, thank you so much for watching. I apologize for this video taking a bit longer than expected. I hope that I could get to a much more consistent schedule. Thanks again, and I hope you all have a great day.